Following Season 1, Episode 1 of House of David, let's take a look at some of the characters depicted, beginning with David himself. Let's begin right off with the convoluted, difficult to untangle legend about David's conception and the question of his legitimacy. According to a traditional Jewish legend found in the Talmud and Midrash, not the canonical Bible, David was considered illegitimate by his family because his father Jesse was tricked into sleeping with his legal wife, Nitzevet, when he thought he was sleeping with his Canaanite maidservant. Sound messed up? It was, despite how well-meaning everything was. Although David's father Jesse was a descendant of Ruth, a woman honored in her own story, the book of Ruth, for her righteousness and love of God. Jesse became worried about his own genealogy when he read Deuteronomy 23:3, which forbade Israelites from congregating with those in Moab, and Ruth was a Moabitess. I confused myself so much when recording this. I had to actually stop editing, go do more research, and come back to it. So here's what I'm adding. It's a wonderful explanation from a website called redeeminggod.com. And the question is, did David's mother commit adultery? It says, after Jesse had been married for many years, had fathered 7 sons with Nitzevet, or as they call her, Nisbeth, and had gained honor as a righteous man and spiritual leader in the community, doubts began to fill his mind about whether or not his line and seed were permanently polluted by his Moabite blood. It was at this point that he resolved to cease all sexual relations with his wife, Nitzevet, or Nisbeth. He did this out of love for her, because she, as a pure Israelite, would be sinning to be married to someone who is of impure Moabite ancestry. Furthermore, Jesse began to doubt the legitimacy of his 7 sons. If he was impure, then his children were illegitimate and impure as well. So Jesse, wanting a legitimate heir, came up with a plan to have a son in the same way that his forefather Abraham had done, through relations with his wife's Canaanite maidservant. Whether Jesse was viewed by God as a true Israelite or just as a Moabite convert to Judaism, the law allowed him to marry a female convert to Judaism. If he obtained a son from this union, this son would be recognized by all as a legitimate heir, thus securing Jesse's family line. But as we will find out, this backfired in a big way and did the exact opposite, making everyone think David was the sole illegitimate heir. So for the sake of his wife, Jesse separated from her so as not to sully her with his Moabite heritage, even though they had already had 7 sons together. Jesse then decided to marry a Canaanite servant and have more children through her. Remember, having children at the time was increasing the value of your estate. This is when it becomes comedic, right out of a bait-and-switch show like The Marriage of Figaro. The Canaanite servant felt bad for Nitzevet, Jesse's wife, because Jesse was going to be having sex with somebody else. So the servant offered Nitzevet the opportunity to pull a bait-and-switch in the same vein as Rachel and Leah did in the story from the book of Genesis. And according to this story, Nitzevet, not the Canaanite servant, was the one who slept with Jesse and conceived David. But they did not tell Jesse this, so Jesse didn't know where David came from when he was born. That means everybody else believed that Nitzevet had slept with somebody else and bore a child from adultery. Remember, please, that this is not in the Bible, and that not everybody believes this legend. For now, we're going with the idea that when David was born, it brought shame to his family. According to his own laments in the Psalms, where he mentions being an outcast, David was forced to tend the sheep alone in the fields to keep him away from the family and community. Again, the canonical Bible itself does not explicitly state that David was illegitimate, but does mention he was the youngest son of Jesse and was overlooked by his father and brothers when the prophet Samuel came to anoint a king, which some interpret as a hint about David's legitimacy. The idea that he was an outcast due to the circumstances of his birth is an extra-biblical legend that adds context to the mysterious circumstances of David's youth. In Psalm 51, it says, I was shaped in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. And later the psalm, presumably written by David, says, "Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." This is thought by many to refer to the situation with how David was conceived. Okay, let's get back to David as a person once he starts growing up. The life of David as a young shepherd in ancient Israel would have been solitary, demanding, and often dangerous. Yet it was also a time that forged the foundational qualities for his later role as a king: courage, skill, and deep faith, very deep faith. David's primary duty was tending his father's flock. This was considered a humble occupation, and it meant he often lived apart from his family in the fields, all alone, as mentioned before, except for the sheep, his thoughts, and God. David's day centered on leading the sheep to fresh pastures and water sources, which was a constant challenge in the rugged Judean hills. Shepherds walked ahead of their flock, guiding them with their voice, rather than driving them from behind. This job required constant attention. He had to ensure the sheep did not stray. He had to find a safe place for them to rest during the hottest part of the day, and carefully count them back into the safety of the sheepfold at night. This type of care no doubt taught him patience and intimacy with those he cared for, skills he would later apply to leading the people of Israel. So, what would be the tools of his trade? He would have a staff or long stick for support, guidance, and, if needed, rescuing sheep. He would have a rod, which is a shorter, often knobbed club for defense. So there are two different things. A staff is longer, a rod is shorter with a knob. And a scrip, a leather bag in which he would keep food, such as bread, dried fruit, and cheese, and stones, which he would use with a sling, a weapon with which he became highly proficient. One that is used not for close-up contact, but a little ways away. A shepherd's life may sound bucolic, but it was far from peaceful, especially when guarding the flock overnight in the open. David had to be the flock's protector against both predators and human thieves. David famously recounted defending his sheep from a lion and a bear. Did he engage in hand-to-hand combat, or did he use his sling during these encounters? He also would have been exposed to the elements, harsh, unpredictable weather of the region, the hot sun, sudden downpours, and cold desert nights. This fostered not only resilience, but a reliance on the land. And of course, there was the cultivation of his skills and faith. The isolation of the fields provided David with time to develop talents that eventually brought him to the royal court. We know he was a skilled musician, and likely spent many hours out in the fields playing his lyre, a small harp, to soothe his flock and entertain himself. This talent was what first brought him into King Saul's service, to play music to calm the king's troubled spirit. That was when the kingdom was ripped away from Saul. Some say David may also played flute. The solitude of watching his flock led to a profound relationship with God, providing the backdrop for his later poetic and spiritual expressions in the Psalms. The lessons of his life, guiding, protecting, and providing for the sheep, became the perfect metaphors for God's care. And you add all of this together, and you have a person whose heart is for God, who's used to taking care of himself and others, and who has been honing his skills in preparation of what might come. Specifically, taking on a lion and a bear to prepare him for taking on a giant.